9 of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs.
2nd, 2020, the committee is resuming its study of vulnerabilities created and exacerbated by COVID-19 and crisis and conflict-affected areas. Briefly, to ensure an orderly meeting, I encourage all participants to mute their microphones when they're not speaking and to direct comments through the chair. When you have 30 seconds remaining in your testimony or questioning time, I will signal with this yellow sheet of paper. Interpretation services are available through the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. Maintenant, j'aimerais souhaiter la bienvenue.
And now I would like to welcome the test witnesses for the first panel. As an individual, we have Valerie Percival, Assistant Professor of International Affairs, and François Audet, Professor, University of Quebec in Montreal, and a Director of the Research Institute, Humanitarian Crises and Aid, as well as Thomas Boyke, Senior Fellow for Global Health, Economics and Development at the Council on Foreign Relations, New York.
First of all, I will start with you by giving you the floor for 5 minutes of opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I will discuss the global response to the COVID-19 pandemic in conflict-affected settings and Canada's role in that response. I will conclude with recommendations for how Canada can better exercise leadership in these challenging contexts. The committee has heard testimony regarding the social, political, and health impacts of COVID-19 in fragile settings. These impacts will reverberate for decades and be exacerbated by climate change, global economic disruption, and uncertain development assistance budgets. Unless the trajectory changes, these populations will be trapped in cycles of violence and fragility with little chance of escape. How has the world, including Canada, reacted? It is a tale of two responses. One tale is inspiring. Networks of local and international health and humanitarian actors, researchers, and advocacy organizations have identified health needs in marginalized groups, maintained health service delivery, and planned for the rollout of testing, treatment, and vaccines. The pandemic strained an already stretched humanitarian system. The system is far from perfect. It often fell short, but it has limited human suffering under difficult circumstances. In contrast, the tale of the second response, global political leadership by states, is a grim and depressing one. As the UN Secretary General stated in September, quote, "The pandemic is a clear test of international cooperation, a test we have essentially failed," end quote. One response cannot work without the other. Health services and other humanitarian actors cannot fully and effectively respond to the impacts of COVID-19 without political leadership to facilitate and remove constraints to that response. The impact of this absence of leadership has been acutely felt in conflict-affected settings. For example, states did not mobilize to offer third-party security guarantees to enable COVID ceasefires to take root and transform into peace agreements. They failed to persuade governments to protect the rights of migrants and displaced people, and they did not effectively confront opportunistic crackdowns by authoritarian regimes. In short, global political leaders did not develop and deliver a clear and unifying message for why international cooperation is necessary and a plan for how to carry it out. Where does Canada fit? Canada has provided important support to the first response, the work of humanitarian and advocacy networks. The government increased its funding of these organizations to support the health response to COVID-19. It brought critical attention to the pandemic's impact on women and girls. But Canada's role in the tale of the second response, political leadership, is disappointing. Canada's rhetoric soars, but our words are not followed by concrete action. Canada sits at the table, we observe, we coordinate, we do not lead. This is a missed opportunity. Mr. Chair, I'm aware that you worked for the UN mission in Iraq. I'm sure you saw the enormous potential for difference makers, the power of leadership from experienced diplomats and coordinated action among states and stakeholders, and how that leadership can curve the trajectory of conflict towards peace. At this critical juncture for conflict-affected states and the world, how can Canada contribute to such leadership? Canada can help the world develop a unifying message, craft a clear plan to address vulnerabilities exacerbated by COVID in conflict-affected settings, and mobilize the international system, as well as Canadian institutions, to implement such a plan. First, for the unifying vision for our engagement in fragile settings and elsewhere, I would suggest a simple one that builds on our feminist approach: protect human dignity and promote human potential. Second, to craft a plan to implement this vision, let's learn from what has worked in the COVID response. We can support networks of civil society organizations, researchers, and other stakeholders. We can facilitate connections between these networks and like-minded states. We can explore novel mechanisms to prevent conflict, stop violence, and sustain peace. And we can use these networks to promote economic opportunities in fragile contexts. And third, we can help mobilize the international system as well as Canadians to implement this vision. Internationally, we could utilize our membership across diverse institutions to promote this approach. This would complement and support the UN Secretary General's call for networked multilateralism. Domestically, we could harness the expertise of Canadians both at home and abroad. Canadian experts are leaders in the fields of diplomacy and mediation, humanitarian and development assistance, global health, and advancing gender equality. Yet too often, our government fails to tap into this expertise. How is this different from what we are currently doing? This approach extends our feminist policy. It engages with networks to develop and implement this dignity agenda. And most importantly, it would ensure that Canada's rhetoric rests upon a foundation of action. Thank you very much. I look forward to questions from the committee.
Thank you very much, Professor Percival.
Merci.
And now I'd like to give the floor to Professor Audet for 5 minutes for opening remarks. You have the floor. Thank you very much. I thank the committee for this invitation. As I have not much time, I'll go directly. So to respond to your inquiries, I concentrated mostly on an analysis of the phenomenon of the marginalization of populations and communities marginalized by the current situation. So quickly, I will present 5 observations and 2 recommendations. The first, what we've seen is that the pandemic seems to have less direct health impacts in poor countries than in rich countries. And I'm talking about direct issues like the effects on health and mortality directly associated with COVID-19. In fact, other than significant exceptions like Peru, Brazil, and Ecuador, the excess mortality in several regions of Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, they are much weaker or much lower than we see in OCDE countries, where the data is not really reliable. We're basing everything on the excess mortality, but also on counts from major cemeteries, which gives our data some reliability. The second observation, if the direct health impacts are not as anticipated, as Professor Percival was saying, the indirect consequences are, on the contrary, already observable and will have lasting impact. And this increasing vulnerability we have seen primarily through the withdrawal of humanitarian supply chains and the decrease in significant investment, 28% in Africa, 25% in Latin America and the Caribbean, and there's less in Asia because of China's economic importance in that region. The third observation is that the indirect impacts exacerbate the vulnerabilities that we've already seen in recent interviews that we made with the erosion of trust in institutions, and this leads to more tensions and social tensions and conflict, particularly given the increase in these inequities. And we've seen a lot of this in Zimbabwe, Gambia, Togo, for example, and also in terms of access to health care. And I will say what the ICRC said. They said a few weeks ago that 30% of medical clinics were demolished in Mali by armed groups because of the withdrawal of peacekeepers. Another of the main vulnerabilities is tied to food insecurity, where the situation is particularly severe. And you have heard of it, I'm sure, in this committee. At the risk of repeating myself, we're talking about 55 million people who are facing high levels of food insecurity in September. And today, I think the data that came out yesterday is talking about 220 million people who are suffering from food insecurity directly related to the pandemic. And that's a huge increase. And this is an analysis that's being carried out in real time. The fourth point is displaced populations. We refer to them often as migrants, and of course many of them are status refugees. They represent today more than 80 million people. And so these are displaced people, and they're particularly marginalized by this situation. The result of the pandemic is that there's been a closing down of international borders, so many millions of people are gathered at borders, and we've seen this, unfortunately, in the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and the Middle East. This significantly reduces access to health care and food. Another situation that's very serious is in Venezuela, where the last few months we've seen a return of some 100,000 Venezuelans going back to their country because borders were closed, or there was literally a ruined economy in neighboring countries, including Colombia. In Venezuela, I must make the committee aware of the situation in the Las Claritas region. This is a vast mining area in the Amazonian part of Bolivar, which is controlled by armed groups and traffickers. And on top of being an ecological disaster in Las Claritas, there is slavery, torture, and unpunished murders. They've been widely documented in these illegal mining operations. And with the pandemic, this area is more vulnerable than ever because of the absence of local authorities who are maybe accomplices or corrupt. And so this has been well documented in the area. The final point of all of the points that I've mentioned, of course, the population that is the most vulnerable is women. Of course, we know that there will be more sexual violence. There will be some 7 million unwanted pregnancies because of the pandemic this year, and of course, these are very alarming statistics. I'll give you my conclusions very quickly because I know I'll run out of time. The first is tied to the importance in Canada of keeping leadership on the agenda of localization of humanitarian assistance. And the humanitarian localization agenda. And as you know, this is intended to transfer the power to local structures. And Canada signed on to this during the Grand Bargain at the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul in 2016. They showed that this is central to sustainable humanitarian responses. And the second recommendation concerns the scientific cooperation to ensure universal and non-protectionist access to vaccines. The current situation requires a vision of solidarity for access of vaccines to everyone. And quickly, in conclusion, for those who think that the long-term indirect impacts of the pandemic will be more significant, I think they'll be more significant than the pandemic itself. Conflicts, famine, and the loss of democratic spaces and erosion of protection of women's rights. I'll be very pleased to discuss this further and answer your questions. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor O'Day.
Minutes of prepared remarks. It's Mr. Boyke, please. The floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today on the response of the international community, including the Canadian government, to the humanitarian needs that have been created and exacerbated by the pandemic. Plagues put a mirror to the societies they afflict. The coronavirus pandemic or address the collective risks groups lack adequate health and economic protections. The Council on Foreign Relations is an independent, nonpartisan institution dedicated to advancing understanding of foreign policy choices facing the United States and in other countries. We recently released a report of an independent task force on preparing for the next pandemic, lessons from COVID-19. In this
Mr. Boyke, I'm sorry to interrupt. Mr. Boyke, I'm going to have to interrupt you for a moment. We have lost translation, interpretation as a result of connectivity issues. Let's put this over to our IT team for some quick advice. I was advised that it may be possible for you, sir, to turn your camera off. We may gain some bandwidth that way. I'm not sure if that's the answer, but Madam Clerk, maybe we can take a quick look and see if we can lend additional support.
Would you like me to go ahead without the video and see if that helps, or do you want me to wait for the IT?
Let's try that for a few seconds just to see if that may solve it.
Great. I appreciate the indulgence of the committee, and I'm sorry for the internet connectivity issues. I'll continue on the three interrelated conclusions from the task force report. First, while confirmed deaths of the coronavirus are approaching 1.5 million globally, the most damaging and long-lasting humanitarian consequences of this pandemic may not be from the virus itself. During the West Africa Ebola epidemic, more people died from the lack of regular medical care, particularly treatment for malaria, than were killed by the Ebola virus itself. Even in nations that have yet to experience explosive growth in COVID cases and deaths, the pandemic is exacerbating poverty and inequities in healthcare access and food security. A recent survey of 18 African Union members found about half the respondents were delaying needed medical care or healthcare visits. A similar percentage reported difficulty accessing medication in the pandemic. The Famine Early Warning Systems Network has estimated that the pandemic has coincided with a 25% increase in food assistance needs continent-wide. The World Bank estimates that there will be 88 million additional people put into extreme poverty as a result of the COVID pandemic. In some regions like South Asia, higher economic growth may overcome some of that poverty that is caused. But poverty in slower growing economies in Africa and in fragile states like Venezuela is likely to persist. And national governments have failed to use multilateral forums effectively to forge a collective response to COVID-19 or its indirect health consequences. A strategic rivalry between China and the United States has undercut potential action at the G7, the G20, and the United Nations Security Council. The lesson here is that multilateral institutions do not spring magically into life during crises. Their success depends on enlightened leaderships from their member states who should be willing to put their differences aside and mobilize these bodies behind a collective effort. We recommend the World Health Organization needs funding for its health emergency program, be required to report when governments fail to live up to the commitments. There needs to be a new global surveillance system to identify pandemic threats that is far
Madam Clerk, I think we may have lost Mr. Boyke completely there. Maybe the IT team could circle back and let's let him know. I will also reiterate that he's very welcome to send submissions in writing and that members of the committee could address questions to him in writing. In the interest of time and the already compressed round that we're going to go into, we will now go into our first round of questions, 6 minutes, and the person leading us off is Mr. Chung. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to start with Professor Percival. Thank you for your opening remarks. You mentioned in your opening remarks that rhetoric soars with this government, but there's little corresponding action. We know that overseas development assistance has been cut by 10% under this government compared to the previous government, from about 0.3% of GNI to about 0.27% of GNI. So my question is, Canada has not met its commitment to 0.7% of GNI for foreign aid for many years. What do you think is an appropriate target for us to achieve in the coming years? Obviously, 0.7%, I think, is not realistic immediately, but what should we be aiming for?
That is a very good question. Thank you very much for that. Development finance isn't my area of expertise, and so I'm hesitant to put a number on it. What I will say is that I think that, obviously we need to commit to increases in our official development assistance budget. I know that the UK has signaled that because of COVID constraints, they potentially will be cutting their overseas development assistance budget. We cannot replicate that here. I would also add that sometimes I think, while I agree strongly that we need to increase our financial assistance, I think we also need to be more nimble and flexible in our response. And that's maybe what I was trying to get at in terms of this idea of mobilizing networks. There are often, there's a lot that you can do with small amounts of money. And I think that empowering both local actors, as Professor O'Day has mentioned, but I would also say empowering our high commissions and embassies overseas to be able to respond quickly. People that I know that work in humanitarian organizations talk about Canada's cumbersome budgetary processes for grants and how long it takes them. I have one friend that is, in the 9th month of a negotiation for a COVID grant. And we really need to roll things out faster. So we need to look at the amount, but we also need to look at the efficiency, and we need to look also at how that assistance is supported by diplomatic action and the leadership. The kind that I talked about.
Thank you for that answer. You mentioned, that there's been bad things, tale of two cities. That during this pandemic, opportunistic state actors have taken advantage of this to engage in conflicts. I think of the conflicts in the South Caucasus between Armenia and Azerbaijan. You also mentioned opportunistic crackdowns. I think of the imposition of a draconian national security law in Hong Kong at the height of the pandemic. So your analysis rings very true. J'ai une question maintenant pour Monsieur
I have a question now for Mr. O'Day. You mentioned the issue of vaccines, universal vaccines.
For universal access for vaccines in your second recommendation. And I wanted you to comment, the government has claimed that it signed contracts for more vaccines per capita than any other country on the face of this earth. And I'd like you to comment on the government's assertion with respect to your second recommendation. Merci.
Oui, merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question. Well, like my colleague, I'm not a specialist in vaccinations, but what we are seeing in terms of the global response on the way in which various states are behaving, sometimes more nationalist or protectionist, rather than being multilateral and universal in their approach, to take the two extremes. But Canada, for the moment, is a little bit in between the two, I would say. And indeed, there was a commitment, a very significant one, made in the purchasing of vaccines. I don't want to make comments on the various brands, but in terms of the sheer number, Canada is one of the ones that has committed to a very significant number of vaccines. So what we're hoping, and this is hypothetical, I want to remind you, but what I'm hoping is that we will have a certain saturation, and then we will have quick immunity established in Canada. That's hopeful. And the surplus will not be stored in Canada, but will have been bought from these companies, can then be redistributed in regions of the world that wouldn't have access to this. And tied to this recommendation, if I may make an extra observation, is the fact that in the ecosystem of a similar pandemic, we saw it with Ebola, so long as the threat exists, in terms of security, Canada is vulnerable. So we also have a national interest in being somewhat protectionist and ensuring, but we should need to ensure that universality as well. We need to have solidarity, and that will also serve us in terms of national security. It's not a paradox. On the contrary, it's intertwined. And I'll come back just quickly to your first question, if I may. We studied financial commitments that countries have made, and I agree with my colleague, Ms. Percival, that the amount has to be within the capacity of the donating country to pay. But what's most important is trust in the promises that donators make.
That everybody gets their round. Merci beaucoup. The next 6-minute round.
Thank you very much. Is Mr. Boyke coming back on at all? Do we know? Because gosh, do I have lots of questions for him.
We can direct questions to him in writing. I don't see him at the moment, Dr. Fry.
Okay.
I am on.
Oh, he's back. Okay.
Well, oh, he's on. Oh, great. All right. But first, I would like to ask a question of Professor Percival. I think you talked a lot about how the government of Canada does not have a global foreign affairs policy, and that nor does it have global foreign affairs experts. Now, if government should begin to talk about doing that in a way that would mean that we actually have a multilateral response with other countries, what are the parameters of developing such a group? How would it be done? What would it cost? And how could Canada set about doing it?
I'm sorry, you cut out a little bit. When you're talking about a group, do you mean domestically or do you mean internationally?
No, you said that Canada does not have a global foreign affairs policy, nor bureaucrats who are able to complete a global foreign affairs policy. How do we go about setting that up, and what are the parameters we need to do to make it work?
So I believe that you're referring to comments that I've made in writing about our lack of a global health strategy.
Yes.
Just to be transparent, I did work at Foreign Affairs and International Trade Canada as a senior global health advisor. So I just want to make sure that the committee knows that. I think that one of the things that I have experienced in my dealings with the Global Affairs Canada in more recent years is that the number of health experts is declining within that department. And the other thing that I have noticed in my interactions with the Government of Canada is that there is a lack of coordination between the Public Health Agency of Canada and Global Affairs Canada in terms of its global health response. So in previous writings, this predated the COVID pandemic, I suggested a global health secretariat at the Privy Council office led by a global health ambassador to act as a coordinator and establish a global health strategy, develop priorities across the Government of Canada with relevant departments. And that kind of secretariat, I think, would have proved very useful during the COVID pandemic.
Thank you very much. I only have a few minutes, so I want to go to Mr. Boyke, because he talks about the inherent vulnerability of an international system of pandemic detection that relies heavily on the transparency, judgment, and discretion of individual national governments, obviously, who vie with each other, Mr. Boyke, for getting vaccines, for doing everything, and don't actually work in the best interest. You also talked about setting up an autonomous group that would watchdog and would find indicators and ways of measuring how governments are responding in ways that are in the best interest of an international global health strategy. So it kind of follows up on what Professor Percival was saying.
Yes, so we make two recommendations responding to your good question. And I should just briefly use the second of my time to say that again, I apologize for the connectivity issues. My written testimony was provided in advance, so people should refer to that.
Yep.
In terms of the systems we suggest setting up, we suggest setting up a hospital-based Sentinel surveillance system. The reason for doing so is in outbreak after outbreak, the affected member states have been slow to report their findings. That's not specific to the coronavirus pandemic. That happened around SARS. It happened around both Ebola recent epidemics. It's happened over and over again. We need other sources of information to be able to identify risks as they emerge. It's also particularly important because member states are likely to be more, WHO member states are likely to be more reluctant to report, given how many countries have imposed travel restrictions on nations once they have reported. So the economic consequences are likely to make them less likely to report. There's a gap in the health system. I'm sorry, you had a question?
I just wanted to ask, if you set up an autonomous watchdog system for hospitals and for looking at policies, health policies set up by individual nations, where is that group going to? Who is the group going to report to? Who is the group going to be responsible to for its own transparency and accountability?
Great. So this is a hospital-based Sentinel system. It wouldn't actually evaluate policies. It would collect information on an ongoing basis about unusual hospitalizations. We actually have a similar system around famines, where there is an international funded system that reports indicators on famines into a database that allow for an independent assessment of risk that goes straight to member states. So this would still provide information to WHO and member states. It just would be additional source of information other than the self-reporting nations.
I see. There would be no ability for it to have teeth at all.
It's not around enforcement. It's around a new indicator of information other than nations simply self-reporting when they have an outbreak, which is what we largely rely on now.
Okay.
Dr. Fry, thank you very
Thank
much. Monsieur Bergeron, la parole est à vous pour 6 minutes.
You have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you very much for our witnesses for being here today. I'll start with Mr. Boyke. We saw with the pandemic that solidarity systems set up by the international community have completely fallen apart. And that is to say that each state around the world just seems to want to get their hands on PPE and et cetera. And you talked about the Foreign Affairs Review that you worked on with Chad Brown and the Peterson Institute for, and you talked about vaccines. And in light of what's happened over the first months of the pandemic, do you believe that we will manage to avoid every man for himself, as we've seen so far? And during the last G20 meeting, leaders said that they would guarantee affordable access to all countries in the world, but this promise wasn't accompanied with any more clear measures, I would say. I don't have the figures in front of me, but I think that it is an unbelievable percentage of the available vaccines are now already reserved for Western countries. So how do you see this playing out for the rest of the pandemic?
Clear, currently. There are two signs.
C'est quoi la proportion? Il me semble que je l'ai vu quelque part.
The first is that the multilateral initiative, COVAX, to further fair and equitable distribution of the vaccine is underfunded. It is particularly underfunded in the resources it needs to build up the infrastructure, and it's underfunded in terms of for distribution in countries. It is also underfunded with regard to the resources it needs to purchase advanced doses. So that's the first sign of concern. The second are that many nations, my own and Canada included, have entered into large advanced purchase agreements for vaccines, which are inherently rivalrous with the multilateral initiative. They compete with it in the sense that they use up resources that otherwise might go to the multilateral initiative, and they also reserve scarce vaccine manufacturing capacity. There is a possibility that nations that have secured a significant amount of doses will be able to share them once they've addressed their own needs. It is unclear the time frame in which that will happen, and that may also depend on which vaccines succeed. The mRNA vaccines that are the most likely to be approved require a cold chain that we have not funded in nations to establish. So those are not going to address global needs. The question are, will other vaccines also generate the information they need to achieve regulatory approval? We don't know the answer to that yet.
Merci beaucoup. Je comprends que ce soit.
Thank you very much. I understand it's unclear, particularly in terms of how Western countries will share their remaining doses once they will have satisfied their own needs or exhausted their supplies. But we still don't know in Canada, for example, how this will be done and on what schedule these vaccinations will take place. I found the figures from Oxfam, the World Organization. 13% of the world's population has already reserved more than 50% of the doses of vaccinations that are planned to be made. So my second question is for Dr. Audet. It's very interesting where you said that developed countries are less affected by the more significant impacts, I would say. So how do we explain this situation? Yes, it's still hypothetical, if you will. These are real-time. This is real-time research we're doing. But I was saying that from the data that we have seen lower rates of mortality in the convincing data that we have seen. But for the rest, it's quite variable. There are environmental issues, climate-related, for example. We saw a similar thing here in Canada, the summer versus the winter time, for example. There might be issues of natural immunity with some populations, which remains to be seen. But this immunity could also be tied to vaccinations or preceding treatments for other illnesses or diseases. We know that the southern regions have been challenged with other pandemics, and it's happened regularly. So they have been massively vaccinated for other things. Maybe they have some resistance that's built up to this kind of coronavirus because of that. There are cultural issues as well, and in rural areas, for example, there is much less contact. It's the same thing in Canada compared to urban areas. So vast, I don't want to make too many generalizations, but in Africa, a lot of areas are quite rural. But all in all, the issues of mortality are lower. And there's another component that's important, and that concerns ages, because we know that mortality affects more people who are older. And so these populations in these countries are much younger than Western ones. So these are two explanatory factors that will be explained over time when science will reach that point.
Professor Audet, and the final round.
Thank you all.
To Ms. McPherson for 6 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our presenters, our witnesses today. This has been fascinating, very interesting for me. I did have a number of questions, and I know I won't be able to get through them all in the time I've been allotted. I did want to follow up a little bit on something that my colleague, Mr. Chong, had brought forward. He had talked about the sort of the unrealisticness of getting to that 0.7% and the historic low spot that we find ourselves in at the moment with our overseas development or our official development assistance. Right now, the international development sector is asking for a 1% of COVID spending that is happening in Canada to be committed to our overseas efforts. I'm wondering if Dr. Percival could talk a little bit about the importance of ensuring that we do have a substantive contribution and commitment, that our contribution is not just words, is not just this verbal ambition, but an actual reality. If she could speak to that, and I guess maybe what the consequences for Canada and for the world would be if we're not able to have an ambition that is higher than where we currently are.
Thank you very much for that question. I think that it's clear for anybody that's looking at the COVID pandemic, and particularly its impact in the most fragile and vulnerable places around the world, that this is a really critical moment. And as Professor Audet mentioned, the immediate health impacts are not what was feared in many of these contexts. But as he also mentioned in his testimony, the indirect impact of not acting robustly now has the potential to be devastating for a lot of these countries. We know that there will be economic disruption. We know there's already social disruption. We know there's been interruption to school programs, and all of these combined effects may fuel conflict. And I listened to previous testimony from other witnesses like Mr. Beardsley who emphasized that point. So I think that it is really critical that we engage robustly, sufficiently, nimbly, and to show leadership.
I think one of the things that you had mentioned is the burden of actually getting through some of the bureaucracy to get some of the funding as being a massive problem, and something that one would think we could deal with quite quickly. I would actually ask Mr. Audette a little bit about that. One of the things that you had spoken about is the impacts if we are not able to share the vaccine across the world in an equitable way. I've read articles that say that we are looking at an increase of 30% morbidity if we don't do it fairly. Could you, and for me that's heartbreaking. That is, as Dr. Percival has said, an incredible failure of the international community and an indictment of all of us. But could you talk, for those that would not be moved by this incredible loss of life, could you talk about what the economic impact on the global economy would be if we have to wait for certain regions of the world 2-3-4 years to be vaccinated?
That is a great question dealing with macroeconomics. I feel that few, if any, researchers today have the recipe for it. Let's look at the budget of Canada, what we said yesterday. We're still talking about hypotheses, and in which there's very few reliable data on what the planet will be in 6 months. So for me, I say very humbly that it's very hard for me to say what it will be in 5 years. But one thing is certain is that in as far as we are in a global context where economies are interlinked, in which every provinces of Canada, and Canada is anchored east, west, north, south with export, import markets and chains, we know that if a region in the world suffers, the rest of the world will feel problems also. So that's the great lesson that we've learned from globalization. But when everything's going well, everything's going well. So consequences of an epidemic like we were talking about on the long term, if we don't act quickly and strongly right now, those consequences will draw us in a very difficult cycle to get out of. For me, it's very complex to try to see what it would be. Of course, there will be morbidity, there will be violence against women, but also major challenges economically, wars, displaced populations. And also very quickly, 9 months ago, our emergency was climate emergency. This emergency still exists. So through this, we have global challenges that will superimpose to each other. So the pandemic has to be resolved. It's a crisis, but the vision, the short-term vision of a balanced economy should not reduce foreign assistance. This humanitarian or development assistance has to be maintained in time, minimally. But unfortunately, I would not feel comfortable to give you smart hypotheses. There's not enough concrete data and information right now.
Answer that was very similar to what I was looking for, and certainly I understand too that the need for us to have a response that is both immediate and ambitious, as well as that long-term response. I do really appreciate what you had said about that and how important it is that we look in the long tail that we know that this COVID vaccine will have.
Elizabeth Person, I'll have to stop you there in the interest of time, and thank you very much for that last round of questions. On our collective behalf, I'd like to thank our 3 expert witnesses this afternoon. Merci beaucoup de votre témoignage.
Thank you for your testimonies, your expertise.
We will let you disconnect now, and we will sound check our second panel and then resume very shortly with that discussion. Merci beaucoup. participants to mute their microphones when they're not speaking and address your comments through the chair. When you have 30 seconds left in your questioning or speaking time, I will signal with this yellow piece of paper. And interpretation services are available at the bottom of your screen through the globe icon. J'aimerais souhaiter la bienvenue au panel. À titre personnel, nous avons Monsieur Ide.
We have Mr. Ide Udanguru,
Adjunct Professor, School of International Development and Global Studies, University of Ottawa. Mr. Nyangodur, I will give you the floor for 5 minutes of your opening remarks, please. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for inviting me and the committee for inviting me to, appear before you today. And greetings. I am coming in from Lagos, Nigeria. It's about 10:27 p.m. here, and but it's an honor to get to talk to you folks about what's happening on the ground in a developing country, as well as feel your questions in an area of my expertise. I'm glad to do so. So, and also before I go any further, I'd also want to extend, this is the first time I'm getting to speak to her since her election, an MP when I've worked with, very closely in the past, and to see her now in a new role. MP McPherson for Edmonton Strathcona, congratulations again on your election. It's good to see someone from an international development background now making policy as well in that effect. So thank you for that. I think my reason for being invited here perhaps is more on the private sector side of things than on the practitioner of development impact or development cooperation. I did have the honor of serving as Director of Policy to 3 different international development ministers in the previous government, and have had the opportunity of seeing Canadian aid in Canadian foreign policy impact developing countries around the world. And so, thank you. I'll focus my comments on 3 main areas. First, food security, gender-based violence, specifically women, peace and security, as well. And then the last part of my talk will be on Canadian-African relations. Suffice it to say, and I think I sat in on the last panel, I think you've also heard a lot from other experts, where there's no doubt we are facing an unprecedented global crisis. It's affecting everybody. It's affecting people here, although not as severe as one would have expected or would have thought initially. But it's definitely its impact on global development, its impact on the global economy, it's obviously unprecedented, as well as the impact on private sector, especially the private sector economy of smallholder farmers, small, medium scale entrepreneurs in developing countries. So the impact is going to be great, and we can't overlook that. On food security, the UN Secretary General recently warned that COVID would disrupt the functioning food systems, resulting in consequences of health and nutrition, and a severity of underfunded, seen, and impact on mothers, babies around, especially in developing countries. So the pandemic has already exposed, a already vulnerable system, which in terms of food security, and this is going to continue. The UN 2020 global nutrition targets have been slowing already, and it's at this point, there is absolutely no way we're going to meet them without having a lot more boldness, a lot more ambition, and accelerated progress towards meeting those goals. With regards to gender-based violence, much like the Ebola outbreak, which some people have spoken about today, it has taught us that violence against women increases, during emergencies. This is no different. In fact, there is this is otherwise being called the hidden pandemic. Oh, sorry. I'll move very quickly to the third point, which is on Canada-African relations. The pandemic and the response to this has to, it's a good time to reset and our relationship with Africa to provide the kinds of infrastructure, the kinds of framework that allow for better private cooperation between businesses to enhance the markets here. Because when the pandemic is over, the bigger issues would always be how would people survive here? How would this market thrive? And I think there's a lot more we can do together in that respect. So thank you so.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nyangudor. Just a reminder, if you could maybe try in the next round to hold the microphone even closer. I don't know if that's physically still possible, but interpretation is doing their very best, and so are you, and we're grateful. Thank you very much. I will now give the floor to Dr. Dagher for her 5 minutes of opening remarks. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the invitation to talk to you about this, I think, really very important subject that we are looking at today. From what I understand, you've already heard from many experts and representatives at UN organizations, as well as international Canadian civil society organizations, about the human impact of COVID-19 in fragile and conflict-affected countries. The human toll of this pandemic is significant and heart-wrenching, and as you've heard over the last few sessions, some groups have paid a heavier price than others. Today, I would like to talk to you about a subject related to the COVID-19 pandemic that has not received much attention. COVID-19 has tested the capacity of every country and every government in the world, including here in Canada. Studies have shown that the quicker a government reacts in implementing appropriate measures, the lesser the impact of COVID-19 is on the country or the areas that are controlled by the government. What most of these studies assume is the capacity of the state to do so. More crucially, though, what they take for granted is that the government and the state institutions themselves have the legitimacy in the eyes of their population to be able to do what is necessary to control the pandemic. Based on significant research that I and others have done related to legitimacy in fragile and conflict-affected countries, we now know that while people value democratic norm systems and structures, the ones who are finding it hard to survive and who are facing a bleak future tend to care more about their survival and their immediate needs, at least in the short term. The entity that tends to respond to their plight and that people perceive to have a visible impact on their daily lives earns legitimacy, or what we call performance legitimacy. As a person who was born
Dr. Dagher, I'm sorry, Dr. Dagher, may I interrupt for just literally 10 seconds? Interpretation Services is asking if you could just slow your speech down a bit. They're having a hard time catching up.
Sure.
And
right.
you'll have an opportunity to elaborate as we go into rounds of questions.
Yeah,
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. So I was saying, as a person born in and lived through a civil war, worked in international development for the Canadian government on conflict-affected countries, and has done significant research on these countries, I can tell you firsthand that this type of legitimacy is very important, and it is often confused with clientelism, and the crisis that is caused is often misunderstood to be one of corruption. But it is real and has significant impact on the goals of building a legitimate and stable state, especially as it relates to the work of Canada or the work that Canada is doing in these countries. So turning back to COVID-19, without legitimacy, the best public healthcare systems and policy responses are likely to bear minimal fruit. What we now see in many fragile and conflict-affected countries is this double-edged sword at play. State institutions lack the capacity to respond throughout the country if they wish to do so, and they often lack the legitimacy in the eyes of at least a segment of the population to impose the rules. So this leads to following 5 main outcomes, or possibly. First, the government has to use violence to pacify the population and force them to follow the rules if they care. The various leaders, even those working in the government or the state institutions, use this pandemic to fuel conspiracy theories or join the battle by providing their own support and services, so earning legitimacy themselves. Local organizations step into this vacuum and give guidance and help give the help needed to support the population and keep them safe. International large organizations step into the fray to either support local organizations or to act as a replacement of the government and of local organizations. And citizens themselves self-organize and support each other and help the fight. So I'll quickly maybe mention Lebanon, not as much as I wrote it down in the statement, but quickly in the sense that when COVID first hit, the state was very slow to react. People reacted and the rest followed. People believed them. When the state started to get involved, people then thought it was a conspiracy theory because they wanted to end the revolution. People stopped believing in the existence of COVID-19. Then the leaders started taking over, and these leaders are in the government. They started taking over, and they started providing the services, which then again made the state look more impotent and made them look strong. And then that played into the whole legitimacy dynamics of the country and of support and power for these leaders. So the other interesting part of this situation is that, you know, any actor, including international NGOs, are also involved in contributing to the sort of transfer of legitimacy between groups. Their replacement of the state and of local organizations and their direct or indirect influence over the plight of these local organizations transfers this legitimacy away from local organizations and local actors, which tends to also exacerbate the legitimacy crisis inside the country. And this is something that we should not take lightly. And this is something that I think Canada has to focus on, especially in situations that are fragile and in conflict affected countries that don't have the capacity. So it's a balancing act. We have to take action on all fronts, but we cannot ignore the role of local organizations and the issue of legitimacy and the idea that if we withdraw legitimacy from these groups, we cause more harm in the long term than in the short term. Donc, merci de m'avoir invité et de m'avoir donné la chance de vous parler de ce sujet très important.
Thank you for having given me the opportunity to speak on this issue.
We're going to have time for a full first round of 6 minutes and then probably a truncated second round of some very quick back and forth exchanges. But the first 6-minute intervention goes to Mr. Morantz. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank the witnesses today. Your testimony is very compelling and alarming, frankly. Just want to start with Mr. Yangador. We've heard that this point made a number of times that Canada's development assistance budget has actually dropped by roughly 10% from the level that it was under in previous governments, from about 0.3 of GNI to 0.27 of GNI. And I just want to tie this into your comments about the economic relationship between Canada and Africa, and particularly around how you would evaluate the effectiveness of Canada's record at targeting our development assistance to projects which are the most economically productive.
Well, if I understand your question, correctly, you're asking, is Canadian aid, focused at the where it would be get the most results and impact? From a policy perspective, I think yes. There's pretty much very little differences in successive Canadian governments in how international development is done, mostly because there's a lot of international agreement and global agreement, and by experts, by practitioners, by people in private sector on how this aid, what the best use of aid should be. I think the major issue isn't, is the aid getting results? It is. The question is, can the results actually be scaled up even more, right? What vehicles do you have, right, to do that? And I would argue that the landscape of development finance and also is changing greatly, and that Canada's foreign policy, Canadian international development assistance programs don't have the complete set of tools today, for the kinds of for the markets that they are targeting. And so the results are there, but there is a lot more, with the right vehicles, you could definitely scale these results, 4 times, 5 times, especially when it comes to the issue of making blended finance available for these markets like Africa or this place where I am right now.
Thank you. Could you elaborate on the issue of blended finances? The area of development finance, what importance do development finance institutes play in attracting, for example, more private sector capital to deal with these issues?
Yeah, blended finance is, it's an emerging area of, it's emerging area. It's an emerging area of development finance, and it's one that is, I think, I would argue, is more enduring, for the next level of folks when they graduate out of, say, that poverty strata, right, or at the bottom of the pyramid, or level, and that's a tool that is able to allow them to stay above that, and also to leverage a lot of private sector capital, by de-risking various projects and deals, and making both liquid cash or investment capital available to them. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Now, Dr. Dagher, you had mentioned Lebanon, and of course, there was the tragic event of the explosions in the port. And you had written in a blog post you made about this, I think on September 15th, that Canada's aid contribution for this incident was too little, too slow, and misplaced. I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on that comment and what you were meaning by it.
Sure, thank you. Well, I am, full disclosure, I am Lebanese. I have dual citizenship. I'm Lebanese and Canadian. I came here after the Civil War ended. I believed when the explosion happened and we saw the results, and all my contacts in Lebanon, because I do have contacts also who work in local organizations. And what we realized was that there was a commitment that was made, but the actual transfer of the money took very long for it to get to Lebanon and to get to the institutions that were actually helping the people. That was one. That's why I said too late, because it took very long for it to get there. Number two, along the way, there were chunks that were removed for administrative costs between international organizations and local organizations, meaning that not all of it got to Lebanon. And three, we did not work with local organizations as much as we should. Now, having worked at CEDA, I do know that PCO does a really good job in trying to understand the local actors on the ground and who is there and who's not there. I know that our embassy in Lebanon, because I also worked on the Lebanon program, our embassy in Lebanon also has a very good handle regarding what local organizations exist and which ones don't exist, and who is aligned and who's not aligned politically. And we had the capacity and we have the knowledge to work with local organizations, but unfortunately we ended up working with large ones and sort of diverting some of the money into the administrative financing of these initiatives rather than truly helping people.
Mr. Morantz, Dr. Dagher, if I can stop you just momentarily. There's been a helpful suggestion by a colleague that we extend each of these rounds in the first panel by about 1.5 minutes. That would take up the entire time rather than having a second round of maybe 1 minute per member. That would give you now an extra minute and 30 seconds, Mr. Morantz, that you are free to take advantage of yourself, or could share with a colleague within your party. So I will let if that's okay with the committee, I'll let the clock run that way. Everybody in this first round gets an additional minute and 30 seconds. Go ahead,
sure.
sir.
Well, thank you, Mr. So on that point, and you have commented on this as well, this whole issue of the utilization of local agencies, in a way that's independent of political or state influence. And I'm wondering if you could comment on what you mean by that, and also in the time we have left, what type of mechanisms could we bring to bear that could make sure that our aid is being used as efficiently as possible and getting to the people that it needs to get to as quickly as possible?
Sure. So my comment is not only based on Lebanon, but on my experience doing research in conflict-affected states and fragile states. And I can attest to the fact that a lot of the leaders involved in the conflict or not involved in the conflict, in the government or outside the government, tend to use local organizations, civil society organizations, to improve their legitimacy and to improve their power. a lot of these organizations are connected to these people, but there are also many that are not connected. And the problem that we have is that if we were to work with organizations that were connected with these people, we then contribute to this whole fight of power and legitimacy, and we end up undermining either democratic development, or good governance, or whatever initiatives we're doing with our programs there, or others are doing, our partners are doing. And so, however, again, there are local organizations that are not affiliated with any of these, and we can definitely work with them. And, your suggestion of what can we do, I revert back to what I had said earlier. Canada has the mechanisms to figure out who's on the ground and who's not on the ground. When I was working also for the government, we used to use our partners also to figure out who's affiliated, who's not affiliated. So it's not that we don't have the capacity. It's just I'm not sure that we actually have the willingness to take the risk to start doing it that way. And I think what ends up happening is we end up being too comfortable with large organizations and just falling back on them for security purposes.
Mr. Dagher, we'll have to leave it there, unfortunately. Thank you both, Mr. Morantz, Professor Dagher. The next round goes to Ms. De Bruzen for up to 8 minutes, please.
I'm sorry, can you hear me now? Just checking it. Perfect. Okay, I will be sharing my last 2 minutes of my time with Ms. Hoda, just at the beginning. I wanted to begin with Mr. Youngador, if I may, because I'm particularly interested in issues of food security. And you had mentioned that, first of all, the UN nutrition targets for this year will not be met, that it's slowing. But you referred to supply chains as well and the challenges that COVID created for supply chains. My question for you is, what have we learned through this COVID pandemic that we could use to strengthen food supply chains to areas that are more vulnerable?
Well, I'll say first we need to increase access to finance. The local producers, there's a big disconnect between the local producers and the resources that they have to get their goods to market. So like I said, I'm in Nigeria today. I go to Abidjan tomorrow, and in both countries, it's not food shortages, right? It's just lack of mechanisms to get the food to where it's needed the most, right? Or distributed across the country. So I think making finance available at concessional or rates that either concessional rates or at market rates that are a little bit more affordable for this market would be one way to do so. But that's not, just getting food to market is not going to be enough. There's an issue as well of the operating environment, and I think my other witness here, colleague, mentioned about this as well. You need to strengthen this market with rule of law, with strengthen democracy, and justice, human rights. All of that needs to be strengthened because working together, these things make a difference in this market. So I would say, one, access to finance. Two is strengthen democratic governance.
Okay, and I'm hoping that I have a couple seconds for Professor Dagher too, but just following up on that, because one of the things that I've been most interested in listening to witnesses is how do we have money land, well, to decentralize? I think that that was the word that had been used by a previous witness in our last panel as well. So if we're looking at trying to decentralize aid in a way to support civil society as well, how do we do that to support food security? It's a concept. How do we make it land?
Is that for me or for the professor?
I will go with you, and then I'm going to ask Professor Dagher to jump in.
Well, you've used, currently right now, almost a lot, I would say a quick majority, maybe, close to 60, 70% of G20 banks don't have the kinds of capitalization that they would need and liquidity that they would need to support their markets, right? So it's good to finance the development finance institutions, but they should definitely be a mandate or some kind of policy where those DFIs are working directly with the local finance institutions, right, to get capital into them so that they can then on lend to their or make that finance available to their own communities and markets. That's how you can do it.
And Professor Dagher, if I can ask you to jump in on that, because it touches right to the heart of what you're talking about, is how do we make sure that it lands appropriately? I don't know if you have any comments on what Mr. Yangador said, and anything to add to that.
Well, I mean, for me, what is really important, and again, having worked with the government, what used to be CEDA at that time, is I know, for example, we have locally engaged staff. I know that we try to draw on local expertise. I also know that we gather quite a bit of information. And so I think that whole idea of decentralization is, again, being willing to give these locally engaged staff a bit more voice, more power, and being able to give us more information. And I think as part of what I've been trying to, I think, say all along is we need to try to understand what they want. We need to try to understand their point of view. We need to try to understand their issues and then work backwards from there and figure out what we can do to help rather than going in already with a preconceived notion of what supports and what doesn't support it. So Mr. Yangador was talking about, how access to market and prices. And I think, a lot of it has to do with really truly understanding the situation. And I think if we were able to do that and we were able to comprehend the systems and structures, the risk of decentralization would not be that high.
Just as a quick question following up on that, for when we look at the most vulnerable within the vulnerable, and I'm thinking about, for example, LGBTQ2 communities around the world, when we devolve to decentralize, how do we make sure that we're also protecting them in that process?
I think the biggest thing that we should do is when we devolve and decentralize, we need to have also an objective to hear from a wide variety of people and a wide variety of organizations. Devolving and decentralizing does not mean that here you go, I'm blind to it and I'm moving along. It's to make sure that, we are doing the participatory approaches that we need to do. We are talking to a wide gamma of people, and we are trying to understand the situation. And I think if we do this correctly and we do, give our locally engaged staff the directives to go speak to various people and to have identified the vulnerable population, I don't think there's much of a risk of us completely ignoring them.
Perfect. I think I go to Ms. Hoda now.
Sorry. How much time do I have, Chair?
You've got a good minute, Ms. Hoda.
Okay. Maybe I'll just build on that then. For Ms. Dagher, about the organizations, I can completely understand why going directly to local organizations would be beneficial, but you spoke about wanting to make sure that these organizations are independent of government, political leadership, opposition, militias, of course, but how can that really be ensured? It's so difficult, and I think that is why oftentimes governments that are removed fall back on these larger organizations, because we hear of accusations that money ends up in hands or into organizations that may have involvement of such of these groups. Do groups exist that have no attachment to any of these actors?
And just a brief answer, please.
Sure. Any conflict country, you cannot have zero contact. It's impossible because you need to be able to maneuver the terrain. But yes, we do have organizations that are independent, and Canada knows of these organizations. I know for a fact, I helped develop a list of these organizations. Canada knows for a fact that we have these organizations. And I think it will take a rethinking. It would take us using different resources, but I think we can get there. I don't think it's impossible.
Thank you so much. Monsieur Bergeron, la parole est à vous.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. During the previous round of questions, I would say we had a really interesting exchange on the fact that COVID-19 is not hitting physically as hard certain groups in terms of seriousness of cases on a medical level. And in terms of deaths, etc., in the developed countries. And there are some exceptions, but generally speaking, it seems to be much less severe in these countries. And the other issue we discussed was this race to the vaccines, which will disadvantage developing countries. So my question is easy. Can we expect, and let's call it a third worldization of the pandemic, if you will, that is to say, a situation whereas the Western world might start to pull itself through it, the pandemic might last for a longer time in developing countries.
Est-ce que la question est à moi?
Is the question for me? One or the other, as you wish. Well, I can start. I can tell you quite frankly that there is an effect that is completely upsetting in developing countries, much more so than here, particularly because in several of these countries, we have many people who live together in conflict or fragile countries. A lot of people live in small places together, so there are more COVID-19 cases. But on top of that, there is what I had said earlier, that people don't believe in the systems. They don't believe in the state. They don't pay attention to the directives. So when we have a situation where people aren't listening, don't want to know, and they think that this has all been manufactured to scare them or for some other reason, there are consequences that mean that people won't take the precautions that are necessary to really survive this and obviously to stop the propagation of COVID-19. When we talk about access to the medications and technology, we're already seeing that. That's something that we saw had a lot of problems with. We saw it with HIV and AIDS. And then the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation came into the debate, and they're the ones who really brought these medicines to the people who needed them so much. It's very expensive, of course, and they don't have the power. It's very difficult to deal with these problems on an international level. In terms of conflict and states that are in conflict or that are very fragile, when government, the police, or the army aren't present across the territory, it becomes even more difficult. Does our other witness want to complete that answer?
I guess I'll just say, there is enormous international cooperation, I think, for the vaccines to get to developing countries. I'm not so concerned about that, and people here don't seem that much concerned that the vaccines wouldn't get to them. What they're concerned about is afterwards. What comes after, right? What are we going to do together because this thing has set back the economies here, multiple decades backwards, right? And they're going to need, not just access to, vaccines. They're going to need access to a lot of, capital, for both the economies to shore up, and then for development programs, right? So that's what everybody's talking about here. Like, what comes afterward? Because there's this, immediately they're going to get vaccines. I think everybody, people are not that concerned about vaccines. I would also add that, the other concern is, which is also a very big thing, is people not believing in the efficacy or the veracity of the vaccines. And that may be something that we should all maybe, begin to work on, because if we can't vaccinate everybody, then that's if people lose faith in, these vaccines, that may be, more prolonged than we thought.
Merci. Je suis heureux
Thank you. I'm happy to hear the optimism that you show on vaccines. Maybe other witnesses were not as optimistic as you. So, like Mr. Moisky said, Boyki said, he said that this is still a very unspecific. But I want to go back to the loss of trust, of confidence with Madame Dagger. We've seen it with the movement that is trying to show that they don't believe in the WHO, and we can see that there's a conspiracy effort in here and other countries of people who are protesting against rules, against the compulsory use of the mask. I thought that do we see that in developing countries also? Yes, very much so. In Lebanon, for example, I receive WhatsApp messages where people are telling me that it's a hoax, that it's done on purpose. All you need to do is drink some water with some lemon in it. And when I look at the list from it, where it comes from the United States or Europe. It's not namely people from there. So we're importing those ideas from there, but also people who are there who don't believe in the current system can find some reasons. And unfortunately, we have some leaders who are using these situations to ruin the trust in the system because they want to use it to improve their own position. And by doing so, they deny the existence of COVID-19 or the necessity of the measures that are offered. One of the problems that we are faced with is that the international solidarity mechanisms are crumbling, where people find one for themselves, like people are just working autonomously, where humanity will probably face other pandemics. And we were so inefficient in managing this one. The goal is not only to try to get out of this current pandemic, but to better prepare for the next one. The fact that we're losing confidence in an organization like the WHO is a central element of what is to come. How do you see what is to come in that regards? Very briefly, please, for your response. I think that international solidarity still exists, but it helps us. But there's also another type of solidarity that is hindering everything we're trying to do. There's the conspiracy issue, and the Canadian government, with its international development work, did not focus a lot on that. It's something that will harm us as humans, as people who are living on this planet for several years to come. Thank you, Mr. Bergeron.
Goes to Ms. McPherson. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much to both our witnesses today. It's been fascinating. I wish that I could have you over for coffee and we could talk about this for a very long time. And of course, it's fantastic to see you, Edie. It's nice to be able to chat, albeit distantly and albeit quickly. The first questions actually will be for you, if you don't mind. You did speak a little bit about the impacts on women and girls. I know that you were with Minister Paradis when he worked very hard on the Muskoka initiative that was a precursor to the Feminist International Assistance Policy. We're very, very proud of the work that was done during that time and what it has led to as well. If you could talk a little bit more about what you see as the gendered impacts of COVID-19 and what you would think would be an appropriate response from Canada.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yes, there's no doubt that in times of crisis, gender-based violence increases. We are currently in the 16 days of actors of recognizing that effect right now and trying to work towards eliminating it. So it's happening. The one area I think that is overlooked or not being looked enough is in this area of peace and women, peace and security. Basically, the conflict enforced violence against women in conflict settings. I think this pandemic is increasing it. Is you can see it here. Just 2 days ago, northern Nigeria, not East Nigeria, same thing happened again. media is not covering it. It's not really in the news or as much as the pandemic itself, and so that gets, again, forgotten and moved away. I think, one way to deal with this is, to maybe partner with, women political leaders here on the continent, especially in this continent of Africa, to advance this issue of women, peace, and security, right? The African First Ladies Peace Mission, which is a very credible organization of First Ladies in Africa, is one such organization that, and leverages, real political power to make changes, right? Because you need sustained, constant political leverage, to make that change on gender-based violence here. Don't get me wrong, the advocacy is great, and it should continue. The programs on maternal health and it should likely continue, as well. But political, what you need is sustained political engagement.
And one of the things too that I think touches on both of the things that you had brought up in terms of women's security and in terms of food security, I think that one of the asks that the sector has in Canada right now is that there is an investment of $400 million per year to food security that would actually be significant help to empowering women, making communities resilient to shock, such as climate change and things like COVID-19. Do you believe that that sort of an investment in food security would also be a vital part of Canada's response?
So I'm not opposed to to new investments, or you won't be shocked to hear me say this. It's not so much that we're increasing or decreasing the level of investment. It's in how we're doing it. What is the mechanism we're using to do it, right? Again, I don't want to continue banging on this, but I think that outcome-based funding, outcome-based vehicles, results-based vehicles, blended finance. This will allow for the leveraging and increasing, the finance that is available. So you can do it now. Obviously, listen, one thing I think development actors have to be aware of is that we also work in a political context locally here as well. So, locally in the sense of, Canada in this case, and you need to buy also political support. So I don't know if there's going to be a big ground shake, and swell for, increase, at this particular time. It's good to wait for when the time is right to do that, but you have a vehicle now that you could use, right, to make that kind of impact in investment that you would need.
Well, and I can tell you that we've done lots of polling, we've seen lots of things. World Vision just did a poll recently that talked about how 88% of Canadians are supportive of an international response. So it does feel to me very much like the political response is lagging behind the Canadian response, and something that we can look at. I'm going to actually ask a few questions of Ms. Dagher, if I could. Very, very interesting testimony. Thank you so much for your comments. One of the things that you talked about is the need for us to invest in or to partner with local organizations. And you spoke about how we have the capacity and the knowledge, but we're not doing it. We are, of course, a signatory to the Grant Bargain. That is an important piece of this. Why aren't we doing it? Could you talk about why we are not? We've said we'll do it. We know it's the best thing to do, and yet we're not.
I think there are two main reasons from my experience and my understanding. One reason is we're never prepared for these emergencies. And that for me boggles my mind a little bit because we've been going through them so many times. But we're never prepared for these emergencies. And when they happen, we need to get the money out. We need to get the money quickly, and we need to get it to somebody that can actually do the work and implement it and do it quickly. So when we have this emergency, we don't have this list, and we don't know who's doing what in the country, locally speaking, and who's independent and who's not, we tend to fall back to these large organizations. So that's one. I think the second one is also just a risk averseness. We're not ready to take on this risk, and it's a huge project to be done. Again, it's so fruitful if we can do it. It's just that we don't want to take on this responsibility. And often we move from one emergency to the other, from one country to the other, from one issue to the other, that we don't really spend time, we don't invest. I think that it's that issue of investing in better understanding and investing in, being less reactionary and more, calm and collected and knowing, you know, okay, there's an emergency, we can do this now. And like we do in Canada, we know what the organizations are and then we work with them, you know, but unfortunately we don't prepare for that.
Is that partly because we have seen such deep cuts over the, you know, subsequent governments to our overseas departments, our diplomatic corps? Would you think that that would be part of that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The other part too is that, you know, we can rely on our partners, our international partners, to get us the information, but at the same time, we also have to take it with a grain of salt. We can't just take their information as a given.
Of course.
And so we tend to not want to just completely blindly rely on them too, but we don't have the capacity to do it on the ground either. So it's a double-edged sword from that perspective.
And then I have one last question, if I can fit it in. Something that's very, very close to my heart that I certainly hope that we are able to get passed as legislation in this parliament is around direction and control, and the way that organizations, Canadian organizations trying to work with partners overseas are really hamstrung by our archaic laws in Canada on direction and control. Could you speak of that a little bit, please?
And again, just a brief answer, please.
Sure. We have a lot of rules here about contracts and about, you know, how you spend money and about results-based management and about structures and systems and reporting and all these things that have to be, you know, the transparency and the documents that they need to fill and the legality of certain things and the contracts that they have to sign. And that hampers a lot of the small organizations to be able to do the work with the Canadian government. And I understand the need for us to protect our taxpayers' money, and I understand the need for us to protect the legality of the issues, but you know, we've moved forward and we've all realized from studying international development and knowing that hampers real effort and hampers real development, and we have to bridge the gap. And yet we're not comfortable because we're still risk averse and we're not willing to go there, but there's so much benefit from doing that.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ms. McPherson. And that brings us to the end of our scheduled time with our second panel. On our collective behalf, I'd like to thank Dr. Dagher for her expertise, her testimony this afternoon, Mr. Dangodor as well, and special thanks for connecting with us at this late hour from Lagos. We really enjoyed our conversation with you, and we will take your points on board carefully. I would now invite colleagues, along with our witnesses, to disconnect, and colleagues, if we can resurface for a brief discussion in committee business in camera. Thank you so much, and see you momentarily.